We're pleased to host you for another webinar in a series of webinars that Jerusalem Press Club is running during this coronavirus crisis. And this time we're hosting Professor Gideon Rahat, who's a faculty member of the Political Science Department at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and he's also an international fellow at the Center for the Study of Democracy at the University of California. He's a co-editor of the book Reforming Israel's Political System, published by the Israel Democracy Institute. You are on mute, and if you want to ask questions, please type them on chat. I want to thank my colleagues from the Jerusalem Press Club for facilitating it. And Professor Rahat will start with a short introduction, and then we'll move to Q&A. Professor Rahat, thanks for joining us, please.
Okay, so we are now, after more than a year that we have only a caretaker government in Israel, after 3 elections, one after the other, in which nobody had succeeded in establishing a government. We now have another attempt to establish a government. Nobody knows whether it will succeed or not. Gantz has lost his time as the one that's supposed to establish a government. This is, maybe it's important, but it's more of a formality, because if there will be a government, it seems, there will be a kind of unity government that will start with Netanyahu as a prime minister. So it really doesn't matter so much that Gantz has lost his mandate or whatever it calls. Now we have about 21 days in which the Knesset is supposed to establish a government, if it can do it. And de facto, it's all about this possible unity government. Of course, there are other options. There's always the option that Netanyahu will succeed in recruiting another 2 members of Knesset. Now we have 59 supporters, 58 from his religious right bloc, plus Orly Levy that moved to his side, from Gesher that ran together with Labor and Meretz. So now if he can recruit another 2 members of the Knesset, he can have his own government. This is not very likely. It could happen before. It didn't happen. He can have his own government if Lieberman is deciding to change his mind. I mean, there are possibilities there. But, and also there is always the possibility of another elections. This is something that can happen. Once it happened, it can happen again and again. I'm not sure that for Netanyahu it's bad, because he feels that he buys time, even though I think that unlike previous elections, if we will have 4th elections, Netanyahu will not face one clear enemy or one clear competitor, but he will face several competitors, and I'm not sure that it will help him. I think it might be a problem for him, because he will have to face, on the one hand, Lieberman and Lapid with their anti-ultra-Orthodox agenda, which might be popular due to what happens in Israel with the coronavirus. They might use it as a way to recruit voters. And there is also Gantz coming to the voters and saying, I did everything I can. I put I put my name and everything. I try to create a unity government, and I failed. So even though they say that opinion polls are good for Netanyahu, I'm not sure that he should bet on elections because of this reason, because I think that running against several parties is not as easy as running against one, and he didn't win when he had to face one. Now we will have to face at least two parties that will compete on some of his potential voters. And second, the coronavirus crisis is creating an economic crisis, and even if he will succeed in making the case that in terms of the virus, Israel is doing quite well or very well, he will still have to face all of the economic problems that will have to be dealt with. So I'm not sure that he have an interest in having another elections. So at the end of the day, nobody knows what will happen. We can have a unity government this afternoon, or we may have fourth elections. I mean, any scenario is possible. The only good news that I have, and this is good news, is that Israel, although we already have 3 elections, caretaker government, coronavirus, is still functioning according to democracy and the rule of law. We had one incident that was very, very dangerous with the conflict between the Supreme Court and the Knesset speaker, but it's behind us, and I hope it wouldn't happen again. I mean, the Knesset speaker did not want to do what the Supreme Court ordered him to do. This was a very problematic situation in a democracy. In a democracy, the rule of law is very important. Even if you do not agree with the things that the court decide, you must obey them. This is crystal clear to anyone that knows what democracy is all about.
Professor Rahat, you mentioned that despite the ongoing elections and the instability, the democracy is functioning, but you mentioned the exception of the conflict between the Speaker and the Supreme Court. But this was a dramatic event, but there are small events which are more difficult to trace, like the erosion of the trust of people in the courts, in the law enforcement agencies, the attacks on the courts, etc. So, are you happy with the state of Israel democracy today?
No, I'm not happy, not with the state and not with the health. Israeli democracy, Israel is losing its democratic qualities incrementally over time in the last few years, like many other democracies in the world. Some countries that were democracies are not democracies anymore, like Hungary, okay? In other places like Poland and even United States, according to international indices that are used for decades, there is deterioration of democracy, and this is true also for Israel. So I must, following your question, I should change my answer a little bit. I wouldn't say that democracy is not under threat. I wouldn't say that incrementally democracy is weakening, but I would say that democracy is still with us in terms of dichotomy, whether Israel is democracy or not. Still, the rule of law is here, and therefore, and other elements of democracy. So we are still there, but I wouldn't say that we are not under threat.
You, in the past, you wrote about Israel democracy being too personalized. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, long before these days, I wrote about it. We also made, Ofer Koenig and me, Dr. Ofer Koenig from the Israel Democracy Institute, we made a cross-national comparative analysis, and we find out that the two countries in which the personalization process was the strongest were Israel and Italy. So we are talking about a process in which the collective, especially political parties, are in decline, while leaders, especially leaders, become the front, take the front in politics. We're talking about changes everywhere in institutions, in the media, in the behavior of voters, in the behavior of politicians. So this is a change in all fronts. And in Israel, I mean, this is clear. We have more than 1.5 years in which the elections are, of course, there are other things behind it, but it's Netanyahu and anti-Netanyahu, Bibi, anti-Bibi. That's what it is all about. Now, it's not that Netanyahu does not symbolize, or Netanyahu does not talk in the name of ideology. He does. He is identified with an ideology, with a stand. And it's not that the people who are against him do not have other stands and other ideologies. But at the end of the day, the shortcut is not Likud versus Labor or Likud versus whatever, blue and white. It is about Netanyahu, yes or no. It is about a person, a specific person. And everything is about him. We have to be honest with ourselves. We wouldn't have so many elections if at the head of the Likud there was another person, or a person that wouldn't have charges in court. So at the end of the day, we can see that all Israeli politics is all about a specific personality, whether people admire him or whether people cannot stand him.
Are you worried about the Shin Bet, the General Security Services monitoring people during the corona patients? And there's now a move to extend the powers they get to do that.
Well, I'm not an expert on it, but as much as I understand, it's the Secret Service, it's Facebook, it's Google, and it's other different companies that are following us everywhere that we go. I mean, the world in which we had privacy does not seem to exist, unless, of course, you leave your smartphone at home. You can do everything without your smartphone, yeah? Nobody can follow you. I mean, they can follow you using other techniques, but the easiest one is once you have the smartphone. So on the one hand, it makes me worry. On the other hand, I mean, is the Israeli Secret Service more of a threat? I don't know. But I mean, on the other hand, we should have, of course, people who care for democracy should not allow it to happen. But once again, we allowed private companies to do what the Shin Bet is doing right now. So it's ridiculous. I mean, the Shin Bet can buy tracking, the tracking from Google, or it can do it itself. That's part of the question, unfortunately, these days. But I'm worried about these things. But that's the world we live in.
We'll hear more about it today, 4 p.m., with a colleague of yours, Dr. Tehila Schwarz-Altschuler, who's an expert on these.
Yeah, she's the expert. I probably talked and spoke a lot of, maybe it's even nonsense. So I should wait for Tehila to speak about it.
I like the modesty of Professor. Thank you. You think that the Gantz, as a Speaker of the Knesset, has some kind of advantage in forming a government in the next 21 days? And also, can he still carry out his threat to pass legislation against Netanyahu?
being the Speaker of the Knesset, give him some control of the Knesset agenda, even though he is limited, as we already saw in the case of Edelstein. And Gantz will follow. If somebody will go to the Supreme Court against the decision of Gantz, and the Supreme Court will decide something, Gantz will obey his the Supreme Court. That's his ticket. So I mean, he has some control of the agenda, and that's good for him. Whether he can pass laws that will be problematic for Netanyahu, there are many ideas out there, like limiting the terms of prime minister, like saying that someone who have allegations against him in corruption cannot become a government for mature, cannot establish a government. There are many ideas out there. He can use them as a threat. Whether he can pass it or not, you know, at the end of the day, it has to do with decisions of very few members of Knesset to hold the pivot, to hold the middle. Now, theoretically, you have 61 against 59, but if one member change his or her mind, everything is changing. So that's a very delicate game.
We talk about democracy, but there's very little democracy in the parties themselves, no? If we look around, you look at Yesh Atid, Israel Beitenu, even Kahol Lavan, I don't know what kind of democracy there is in these parties.
Well, intra-party democracy is clearly in decline. The most democratic parties were Labour and Meretz, and they are really now very tiny parties. Likud is still democratic in some senses, but it is clear to anyone that looks at it that it becomes more and more a kind of a leader party, even though it still have some intra-party democracy in comparison, of course, to the other parties. These days, unfortunately, parties that are democratic are quite unsuccessful, while non-democratic parties are doing quite well. It's not only in Israel, we have in other parties, in other countries, we have leader parties, especially populist leader parties. So intra-party democracy is not very strong these days. And intra-party democracy is something that we have to rethink about, and to rethink how we in this age, we make party democracy worthwhile for the parties that have it. Because if democratic parties are doing worse than undemocratic parties, so, you know, they will imitate the undemocratic parties. It was the same when party primaries was seen as the last word about democracy. So the parties imitated each other and they adopted party primaries. These days they imitate each other by adopting, by giving political leaders very strong, a lot of power, because that's what seemed to be a successful strategy when the parties compete with each other. So we have to think, that's something we do at the Israel Democracy Institute, how you can have, on the one hand, successful parties in terms of elections, and on the other, how can they have intra-party democracy that would not hurt them, but rather would give them some more power vis-a-vis the other parties. So parties will imitate each other and become more democratic rather than less democratic.
We have too many parties, don't we? Is there a way to limit the number of parties? It's always a representation versus governance. So what are your ideas, or the ideas about it?
Well, Israeli politics these days is very interesting because we don't have many. We have the lower number of Knesset factions or Knesset political party groups ever. But each of these groups, or not each, but most of these groups are composed of 2, 3, or 4 political parties. Why? Because we have increased the electoral threshold to 3.25%. It used to be lower. So the political parties are coming together before elections. They make alliances, and then they pass the threshold. Some of them stay together, like the joint list of the Arab and Communist parties. Some of them are divorcing, like Meretz, Labor, and Gesher. So the politicians are always finding ways to get around the different laws. So we now have a lot of small parties. Maybe about 20 parties are represented in the Knesset. But when they were elected, it was only about 8 electoral lists. What we can do against it, I mean, I can give you ways to increase the size of the large parties, like the law that we want the Knesset to adopt in the Israel Democracy Institute. We recommended that the largest party would get the head of the largest party would be the prime minister. Okay, that was the law that we recommended, and we said it will create pre-election coalitions. It will create. It would be clear after the elections who is governing, and if there will be a majority in the Knesset against this prime minister, they can replace him using the so-called constructive vote of no confidence that we have. So there are ways to encourage politicians to join large parties, and there are ways to encourage voters to vote for large parties. But following what we see these days, we might still have very small parties. People that are popular might create a party and say, okay, you take me and I will, and give me your spot number 5 in your electoral list because I'm worth 1% of the electorate and this is worthwhile for you. That's what they do these days. And I'm not sure there is any way around it. In some countries, they say that party alliances should have higher threshold, okay? So if you are a single party, your threshold would be 3%. And if you run 2 parties together, your threshold is 5 or 6%, etc., etc. I'm not sure that it should be adopted in Israel, but it's a problem that is probably known in the world, and that's how they find solutions for it.
There was in the past an attempt to adopt a system, sort of presidential system, by electing the prime minister directly. You think there might be calls today to return to this kind of system?
No, I think the problem with this, the system, that there were many problems, but the main problem was that people would vote for a prime minister and then they would vote for sectorial parties, for parties that represent identities. And it was very hard, after the prime minister was elected, it was very hard to establish a government and especially to sustain it, because the pressures, the number of parties, and especially the size of the large parties shrank. So, and it was very hard to govern in this way. So this is a bad idea. Actually, what I already suggested, you can see it as having a direct election, but with 1 vote. Because if the head of the largest party is the prime minister, so you select the party and the prime minister at the same time. You have an opportunity to do it with 1 ballot. So you yourself already build the coalition. If people have 2 votes, that's what they did. They voted one for the prime minister, but not for his party, because they say, okay, we are not suckers, okay? We can divide the vote, we can empower ourselves by voting for a party that is even closer to us. Once you have the idea of having only one vote, but your vote might decide who will be the prime minister, you make the compromise yourself. You decide whether you support a small party and do not have influence on prime ministership, at least not direct influence, or you vote for the prime minister together with his party or party alliance.
What do you make of the rise of Arab vote? And do you think this is a sign of opening for a new era where Arabs can be part of government?
I think that's one of the happiest developments of the last year. The fact that Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel vote to the Knesset means that they take part in Israeli politics, that they want to take part in Israeli politics, that they believe that they can have a say and can have influence. So this is something that Israeli democracy, even I would dare to say the Israel democratic and Jewish state should be happy about. This is a very positive development. So I think that's good. Now, of course, there is the problem that the stance of the Arab parties are far from the Jewish Zionist consensus. It's very hard to bridge between the two forces. I hope over time there will be such bridges, because if you think about it, at the end of the day, 95% of the interests of all of the citizens of Israel can be bridged. It's about welfare, it's about the economy. And, you know, even if we think about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it wouldn't be solved tomorrow. So there can happen, there can be a lot, and I think it's very important what we saw here. I mean, this is a very good sign for integration, and I think that we should, I don't know, as a Jew and a Zionist Jew, I'm very happy about it, and I welcome any voter, any Arab, Jewish, Christian, Druze, whoever voter that come to vote. It's very important. Once you vote, you give legitimacy to a system. You give some type of trust, and it's a very good thing that happened this year.
Last question is about corruption. Many years ago, then Prime Minister Rabin, in his first term, resigned over a technical breach of the law of his wife. And today we have Benjamin Netanyahu, who runs for a premiership with 3 serious charges. You think the Israeli public has become indifferent to corruption?
I think that it's not only the Israeli public, I think it's especially the elite. Things have clearly changed in terms of corruption. We don't have to look back at Rabin. Ehud Olmert has resigned also, a long time before anything happened. Any allegations, I think. So it's at the end of the day, it's all about the behavior of Netanyahu. Netanyahu has changed the game. And Netanyahu is not, you know, one of a kind. We have leaders all over the world. Trump is a very good example that see the judicial system, the elites, the media, everybody is against him, and he represents himself, and probably he also believes in it. I'm the representative of the people. The people means a majority of the people or close to a majority. And who are you, judges or other people that were not elected by the people, to be against me? Okay, that's the line. I think this line did not exist in the old days. I cannot see how Olmert could have used this line. He wasn't so popular. He wasn't popular at all. So I'm explaining what's going on here. I don't think that we have to celebrate it. It's a very problematic world, because but the norms in Israel are different from other countries. I read here and there that in some countries, ministers that did not follow the rules of the coronavirus isolation, they find that some ministers did not obey the rules, and these ministers had to resign. In Israel, it seems that this is not the norm, okay? In some cases, people apologize, like the president. In other cases, they don't even bother to apologize. So I think there are different norms here, and it's probably quite problematic when you compare it to other places. In some other places, of course, the norms are even worse than they are in Israel. I mean, when you look at the world, you can see that in some cases, corruption is very rare, and if somebody is captured for doing very small things, they have to resign and go away. In other places, corruption is the government. So we are somewhere not in a very good place. Let's say if there are 200 countries in the world, we are, in terms of corruption, somewhere in number 30 or 40, which means that we are at the top, but not at the top of the top, where the OECD countries, most of the OECD countries, or most of the highly developed countries are. So that's where Israel is. And this is, of course, worrying for people like me that want to be number one in terms of democracy, as well as in other things.
Professor Gideon Rahat, thank you so much for this. And I want to thank Danai Marks of the Israel Democracy Institute for also helping us with this. And stay tuned to our next webinar at 4 p.m. this afternoon with Dr. Teila Schwarz-Altschuler on GSS monitoring people in the coronavirus crisis. Thank you and good day.
Have a good day.
Without Gideon.